It was one of those warm, golden afternoons where the sun seemed to linger just above the tree line, casting its shimmering reflection across the still surface of the lake behind my house. For me, the lake wasn't simply a body of water. It was a sanctuary, a slice of calm in the middle of the chaos that everyday life often brings. I had owned this property for years, and with it came full legal ownership of the lake. It was written in my deed, confirmed by the county's land records, and understood by anyone who cared to look at the paperwork. That lake was mine, no different than the shingles on my roof or the grass in my backyard. So when I set up my chair, that day, baited my hook, and cast my line into the gentle ripples, I thought of nothing more than enjoying an afternoon of peace. But as fate would have it, peace was the last thing I was going to get. I heard the crunch of footsteps before I saw them. 3 figures emerged from the pathway that led from the neighborhood into the common area, and immediately I knew this wasn't a friendly visit. Leading the group was the HOA president, a man with a permanent scowl etched into his face, clutching a clipboard as though it were an extension of his arm. Behind him trailed 2 other board members, both of them wearing that same air of superiority that seems to come with the title. They walked with a purpose, a kind of theatrical self-importance, as though they were law enforcement themselves rather than just neighbors who had managed to win a vote at the last HOA meeting. "Sir," the president barked, not even bothering with a greeting, "you're in violation of community rules." I glanced up from my chair, confused but not yet irritated. "Violation?" I asked. "For what?" "I'm sitting on my own property." "You're fishing in the lake," he said, flipping a page on his clipboard as if he needed written proof to justify his tone. "The HOA rules explicitly prohibit fishing in common areas." At that, I couldn't help but chuckle, though I quickly realized laughter would do nothing to diffuse the situation. "This isn't a common area," I replied evenly. "This lake is part of my deed. I own it outright. You don't have jurisdiction here." That statement seemed to set him off like a match to gasoline. His jaw tightened, and his voice grew louder, as though volume could substitute for authority. "The rules are clear," he insisted. "Fishing is not allowed. We'll be fined $3,000 for this violation." Now, a lesser person might have been stunned into silence at the audacity of a neighbor trying to levy such an absurd fine, but I knew my rights, and more importantly, I knew my property lines. "You can't fine me for something on land you don't control," I said, standing up now so we were eye to eye. "This lake doesn't belong to the HOA. It belongs to me. If you'd like, I can get the deed from my files and show you." Instead of taking me up on that very reasonable offer, the president puffed out his chest and motioned to one of the board members to write something down. "You don't need to see your paperwork. You'll receive notice of the fine in the mail. And if you continue to defy community rules, there will be consequences." It was absurd, almost comical, and yet there was an edge to his words that made my blood boil. "The only consequence here," I shot back, "is you trespassing on my property and trying to intimidate me. I'm not paying a dime for some made-up violation." That was when the situation spiraled from laughable to surreal. With a theatrical sigh, the HOA president pulled out his phone. "If you won't comply, we'll let the authorities handle this," he said, dialing 911 in full view of me. His tone shifted as soon as the dispatcher answered, dripping with fake concern. "Yes, hello," he began. "I'd like to report a trespasser. There's a man fishing illegally in our community lake and refusing to leave." I stood there dumbfounded, listening to this man report me to the police on my own land. He wasn't bending the truth. He was outright lying. "Community lake," he said. "Trespasser," he said. Words that might have carried weight if the reality weren't so different. For a brief moment, I felt a flash of panic. It's never pleasant to have law enforcement called on you, no matter how innocent you are. But almost immediately, that panic was replaced by a calm certainty. I had the truth, and more importantly, I had the paperwork to prove it. When he hung up, he gave me a smug smile as though he had already won some kind of victory. "The police are on their way," he said. "We'll let them decide." I couldn't help but grin back, not out of friendliness, but out of the quiet confidence of a man who knows the ground he's standing on is his. "Good," I replied, They'll be very interested to see the deed. As we waited, the HOA members continued their act, muttering about liability and rules being rules, as if repeating the words could somehow change the facts of ownership. Meanwhile, I walked calmly into my house and retrieved the thick folder where I kept all my property documents. I laid the deed out on the patio table next to my fishing gear, ready for the officers to see. I figured if the HOA wanted to turn this into a legal matter, then legal proof was exactly what they were going to get by the time the police cruiser pulled up. The sun was starting to dip lower, painting the lake in shades of orange and pink. The scene was almost picturesque, if not for the ridiculous standoff happening on the shoreline. The HOA president rushed forward, waving his arms as if he were flagging down an ambulance. "Officers," he called, "this man is trespassing in our lake, refuses to comply with community regulations." The two officers stepped out of their vehicle, calm and measured, and turned their attention to me. Before they could even ask a question, I gestured to the table. "Good evening, officers." "Yeah, I'm glad you're here." "This is my property deed, and as you'll see, the lake is part of the parcel I own. These gentlemen are mistaken in thinking it's a common area." The younger of the two officers picked up the paperwork and examined it while the other listened to both sides. The HOA president repeated his claims, growing increasingly frustrated as the officer's eyes scanned the boundaries clearly outlined on the survey. It didn't take long for the officer to look up, meet my gaze, and nod. "He's right," the officer said flatly. "This lake is part of his private property. You have no authority here." The HOA president's face turned crimson, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of the water. He stammered something about community rights and interpretation of the bylaws, but the officer cut him off. "Sir, bylaws don't override a property deed. Can't fine someone for fishing on their own land. You certainly can't call 911 to remove a homeowner from his own property. We're talking to..." Was in that moment, watching the smug expression melt into shock, that I realized just how far they had overstepped. Their arrogance had driven them to weaponize the very system meant to protect people, and in doing so, they had exposed themselves for what they were. Neighbors drunk on a little bit of power? They never truly had. The silence that followed the officer's statement hung in the air heavier than the summer humidity. For the first time since they stormed onto my land, the HOA board members seemed at a loss for words. Their posture shifted from self-righteous certainty to something resembling embarrassment, though it was clear they were still searching for a way to regain control of the situation. The president in particular looked like he'd swallowed something sour. His clipboard, once held like a badge of authority, now dangled limply at his side. The younger officer, still holding my property deed, placed it carefully back onto the patio table before addressing the group. "Gentlemen, I'm going to make this very clear," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This lake is not HOA property. It's not a common area. It's private, and it belongs to him." He nodded toward me. "Calling 911 under false pretenses is a misuse of emergency services. You cannot treat this man like a trespasser on his own land, do you understand?" The HOA president opened his mouth to protest, but was quickly cut off by the second officer, an older man whose patience had clearly worn thin. "No buts," he said sharply. "You're done here. Pack it up, head back to your side of the neighborhood, and stop harassing this homeowner. If you continue to do this, you're the ones who could face charges for trespassing, harassment, and potentially filing a false police report." That last part landed like a hammer, as the word charges seemed to strike a nerve, and I could see the board members stiffen as the weight of the situation finally dawned on them. They hadn't just lost their little power play, they had nearly crossed into criminal territory. I leaned back against my chair, fishing rod still propped beside me, and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It was a vindication that no fine, no argument, no HOA bulletin board announcement could erase. For the first time in this ridiculous encounter, I felt like the ground rules had finally been set straight, not by me shouting back at them, but by the neutral authority they had tried to weaponize against me. "Officers," I said, keeping my tone polite but tinged with satisfaction. "I'd like them escorted off my property. They've already disrupted my afternoon enough." The older Officer gave me a slight nod before turning back to the HOA trio. You heard him? You're on private land without permission, so that makes you trespassers. Now, I suggest you leave immediately before we make it official. It was a sight I will never forget. The same 3 people who had marched onto my land minutes earlier with puffed chests and smug certainty were now shuffling back toward the path like chastised children. The president muttered something under his breath. Something about this isn't over, but his bravado had all but evaporated. The other 2 avoided eye contact entirely, focusing instead on the gravel at their feet as they trudged away. The officers remained until the HOA members had fully disappeared from view, making sure there would be no last-minute confrontations. Only after the trio was gone did the younger officer turn back to me. Sorry you had to deal with that, he said. We see situations like this more often than you'd think. Sometimes HOAs overstep their bounds and try to enforce rules where they don't have authority. That's an understatement, I replied with a wry smile. I appreciate you both setting the record straight. Keep your deed handy, the older officer added. Something tells me this isn't the last time they'll try something like this. But legally speaking, you're in the clear. They don't have a leg to stand on. With that, the cruiser pulled away, its taillights glowing red as dusk began to settle over the neighborhood. The chirping of crickets replaced the earlier tension, and for the first time all day, I felt the peace I'd come outside to find in the first place. I picked up my fishing rod again, cast my line back into the still water, and watched the ripples spread outward. But as much as I enjoyed the quiet, I couldn't help but replay the scene in my mind. The sheer arrogance of the HOA board amazed me, not just that they thought they could find me for fishing on my own property, but that they actually believed dialing 911 would end in their favor. It was a textbook example of people so blinded by their perceived authority that they couldn't recognize where that authority ended. They'd turned what could have been a simple conversation into a full-blown confrontation involving law enforcement. And in doing so, they'd humiliated themselves in front of the very officers they'd hoped to enlist on their side. Word of the incident spread quickly. By the following week, neighbors were already whispering about it. Some stopped me at the mailbox to ask if it was true that the police had escorted the HOA board off my property. Others chuckled and shook their heads, clearly enjoying the poetic justice of it all. A few even admitted they'd had their own run-ins with the board over petty violations, were secretly glad someone had stood up to them. The president, of course, tried to spin the story, framing it as a misunderstanding in the HOA newsletter. But the truth was too juicy to bury. Everyone knew what had really happened, and no amount of wordplay could erase the image of him being told to leave by uniformed officers. For me, experience served as a reminder of something I already knew, but hadn't fully appreciated until that day: the importance of knowing your rights. Property lines aren't just lines on a map, they're legal boundaries that matter. When you don't understand them, or worse, when you try to pretend they don't exist, you set yourself up for embarrassment and consequences. The HOA had assumed their bylaws carried more weight than my deed, but they learned the hard way that private property law doesn't bend to neighborhood politics, even now. I sometimes sit out by the lake and smile when I think back on that afternoon. Not because I enjoy conflict, but because there's a certain satisfaction in seeing justice play out so clearly, so definitively. The HOA came at me with fines and threats, thinking they could intimidate me into submission. Instead, they walked away disgraced, escorted off land they had no business standing on in the first place. In the end, the lesson was simple. You can only push people so far before they push back. For the HOA board, that meant an embarrassing retreat under the watchful eyes of the very police they thought would enforce their will. For me, it meant reclaiming not just my afternoon of fishing, but my peace of mind. And as the sun set over the lake that day, I realized I had caught something. Far more valuable than fish, I had caught the undeniable satisfaction of standing my ground and watching arrogance sink under its own weight.